Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 33. The story starts with Salem saying he'd like Sabrina to meet someone who's wearing a cloak, and Sabrina immediately assumes he's a warlock. Probably because he's dressed like that for no apparent reason. And why else would she not be able to see his face just because he's got a hood up? Sabrina then insults Salem because Hilda made a rule against warlocks in the house, despite being a witch herself. And Sabrina mentions that she had that rule ever since her 6th birthday party. Salem's still nervous and says he knows. He tells Sabrina that he's leaving. I love the mystery over why this person's here. Lysander is a recent graduate of Druid Law School, so Druids are warlocks. He studied Salem's case and thinks he can get his sentence overturned. How? It's been proven that he wanted to take over the world, and he still does. He's just really desperate to believe the taupe spot will work out for him. He says sweetly that he's loved watching Sabrina grow up, but he's been living as a cat for over 600 years. I was running under the assumption that he wasn't even a cat for 200 years. It just makes it more cruel to have him be a cat for over 100 years because that's worse than the sitcom. Hilda grabs Lysander angrily, and Salem somehow figures out that Hilda's right behind him. Wait, doesn't a cat have a great sense of smell? Wouldn't he know Hilda's right behind him without needing to guess it based off Sabrina's reaction? Wasn't Lysander the name of the main villain of Pokemon X? It's neat to see that name a second time. Hilda reads a paper and says that this is a unique perspective on Salem's trial and could hold up in court. How? We should know what it's saying. Hilda tells Salem that this is his decision, and he asks Sabrina for a hug, and she runs away crying, not wanting him to leave her. Since when is she so attached to him? Usually she seems to think of him as a nuisance. Anyways, it seems forced that Salem's planning on leaving. The story could have easily not had this kind of drama because he has no reason to plan on leaving the house. Maybe he misses the kind of independence that having your own house would give him, and is sick of following their rules. But there's no reason he couldn't visit Sabrina every day, and there's no reason he wouldn't be planning that and tell her. Of course, she'd still have a reason to be upset because she's gotten used to him in his cat form, and that's what she's grown to love. But he could turn himself into a cat to humor her. And at that point, she's being selfish because he's not as comfortable being forced to be a cat. Hilda says Salem deserves this as Sabrina slams her door, and it turns out Lysander was tied to a chair by Hilda. Chloe finds Sabrina crying, and when Sabrina says her kitty's gone, she says that she's sorry and knows how she feels. Why does it have to wreck the mood of the scene by not having Chloe in multiple panels? Instead, it looks like there's a ton of Chloe's in one panel and 2 Sabrina's, and that's really visually distracting. She's telling a sad story about how a stray puppy she and her brother tried to nurse back to health died anyways. But the artist is ruining it by trying to somehow portray it as a joke. Sonic Boom's comic made fun of this kind of thing, and I hate that she was written to say wah. She's upset about something legitimate. Why make fun of her? It's already making fun of her because she's wrong, and why does it have to do that to her when she's telling a legitimately sad story? She thinks Salem died and he didn't. I guess she didn't know Sabrina, or wasn't friends with her when she was that little, and that's why she didn't tell her that sad story as soon as it happened. She thanks Sabrina for the tissue and tells her to be glad Salem was around for as long as he was. This is a good friendship moment between the two. She's actually making Sabrina feel better, because she's telling her it could be worse. In the other realm, Salem's counselor is nervous because he didn't know his case would be heard in the home of the meanest judge there is. She even looks mad already. It's a shame that she's being portrayed as a monster here with her appearance. Because scary appearance and emphasizing of the S's aside, she's right. It would be satisfying to see her call out Salem. He did want to take over the world. She says, "Do you deny that you attempted to use your warlock powers to conquer and rule planet Earth?" Shut up! And now you want us to forget about that just because you've been babysitting this mortal girl for a dozen years? Let's ask her! If she went into more detail, this could easily be the reason you suck speech. She could go into detail about what kind of evil person Salem was to want to do that, or what he was planning to do as the ruler. I'm not really holding this against Salem because we don't know what he would have done as the ruler, and at least this kind of backstory makes him an interesting character. She tells a giant bay leaf to restrain Salem, who wanted to leave Sabrina out of this, and she tells Lysander to bring her Sabrina. He says right away, but doesn't proceed to warp Sabrina to him immediately. I mean, he has a picture of her right there to work off of. So she could just imagine her and warp her to trial right away instead of grabbing her and putting his hand over her mouth when dinner's ready. He shouldn't have to be portrayed as a bad person for this. He's being forced to do this. And and the judge has every reason to want to meet Sabrina. Hilda sees a flash of light, and that leaves behind soot for no reason for the first time ever, which smells like beginner's brimstone. That came out of nowhere and is never mentioned. She says that she can easily trace his vapor trail. How convenient for her. Lysander brings Sabrina to the other realm, and he says that he'd be disbarred otherwise. Sabrina says that he'll be lucky if he's not dismembered when Hilda gets a hold of him. It's not kidnapping if it's an ordered appearance in court by a judge. Then her not showing up would be contempt of court. Lysander says that the judge is a megalomaniac. Either the writer or Lysander doesn't know what that word means, or she's no better than Salem. It's a miracle he was able to say all of those words starting with M without screwing up. They go into the building through a chute and land hard on the floor instead of just floating down and landing gently with their magical powers somehow. The judge says it's about time, but it's her fault because she could have gotten them here a lot faster. Realistically, it turns out Salem couldn't breathe very well with the leaf against him as he's gasping after it stops bothering him. I guess the leaf was enchanted. He apologizes to Sabrina and he's told to not tamper with the witnesses. Hilda eavesdrops in spirit form as Sabrina says that while she was sad Salem left, she's dealing with it thanks to her family and friends and he has his own life to lead. Why isn't she talking about what Salem's like and how he affects her life? Which would be poorly. And for some reason Lysander's allowed to play a violin during this, which wouldn't be legal. This is so stupid. The meanest judge ever says she's heard enough and lets Salem go free. If I was Salem, I wouldn't say anything after this and would just be grateful that I got so lucky. Hilda thinking, uh-oh, immediately gives away the twist that was obvious from the start of the story anyways. It would have actually been much better writing if the realistic thing happened, and the judge wasn't convinced, like was foreshadowed. But instead makes a story about yanking the dog's chain twice as cruel by having 2 hope spots. Even though Salem admits that his plan to take over the world was wrong, he says he'll succeed the next time. Sabrina thanks Salem for changing his mind so that he could stay with her, and Salem looks sincere as he says that she's coming to the wrong assumption. Hopefully, I'm supposed to believe Sabrina here when she says that he just put on that stupid act so he'd come home with her. If anything, you'd think that Sabrina being forced to speak honestly about Salem would just prove to the judge that he's still trouble because most of Salem's impact on her life has been casting spells to help her that don't work out. The story ends with it turning out that Hilda used magic to brainwash the judge and Lysander into loving each other. I say this because she shows up and says that she was just saying goodbye to the lovers and says that they make a cute couple. And Sabrina asks if she had anything to do with it. And Sabrina's smiling at this because she's naive enough to think there's nothing wrong with the love spell. If Hilda's okay with this too, why is she still single? She probably knows she wants to be happy with a guy who only loves her because of a spell. But apparently that doesn't extend to her thinking it's wrong to meddle in other people's lives and give them a relationship that's just as fake. It's meant to be seen as a happy ending for both of them. I can't imagine Lysander's family would be happy about seeing this woman as his future wife. Hilda being like this was foreshadowed because she advised Sabrina to use her genie wish to wish up the perfect boyfriend. I'm not mad at this. I get that's only supposed to be seen as a happy ending for the 2 characters that they didn't have to have a happy ending for. And they're never going to find out their love was forced by a spell. But this doesn't have to be addressed. Because we're supposed to think Hilda is the good guy because she lectures Sabrina. The next story has a freaky looking panel where Sabrina naturally screams because Salem's juggling his head and is magical enough to still be alive while doing so. The artist will show us this just fine. It makes sense that he's able to do this if you consider that there's no room for human vocal cords and a human brain in the body of a cat, and so obviously those human parts of his body are still there, but invisible, are infecting him instead through quantum entanglement, a magical spell. Which means that it doesn't actually matter if he juggles his cat head because his real brain has nothing to do with it, because it won't fit in it, and will keep being in contact with his cat body regardless through his soul. His soul's possessing his cat body like a ghost. And that's why he's still able to keep using a unicycle and making juggling motions without his head connected to that body. I have to say all this because he's able to talk during this, so he's still got higher brain functions. Still, this is forced because obviously if he wants to come to the pet fair, he has to behave like a normal cat. And he'd know that. And somehow Sabrina has to tell him this, and he doesn't even know what that means. He's met normal cats before. And if he literally just acts like a normal cat at the pet show, that'll be boring. Also, hasn't this comic tried to have a pet show story before? But didn't get to the actual show part that time. but that was gotten to in earlier continuities before. Why does Jem have to be in the story? Of course she wants to compete again. This time with a brand new animal entirely, a cat. Apparently she was fine with ditching her last pet. Or still hasn't, just doesn't have as much faith in it as the shiny new pet. Salem wants to be let out of the humiliating cage Sabrina's carrying. I guess Jem only calls Salem putrid because she doesn't like Sabrina, for some reason. Sabrina bitches about Jem using a stroller without explaining why. Jem says that Perfection won 11 cat shows. Not with her, or else she would have entered her last time instead of that dog. Why doesn't Jem hear Salem talking so close to her? He wants to zap Jem and her spoiled cat. Why does he think Sabrina has to open up the cage for him to do that? Logically, magic would be able to teleport itself out of the cage and have its starting point be outside of it, because it's magic, and it can already teleport. He could have the beam start outside of the cage. He could warp out of the cage, if it's magically enchanted, so that... I guess Sabrina was smart enough to put him in a cage that keeps him from using his powers. Which he'd be smart enough to do to get out of the cage. At least Sabrina admits that she can't blame him for being angry. If this was the Sabrina I knew, she would have zapped Jem herself. She could scare her and then erase her memory. She tells Salem that it's not fair for Salem to zap every pet he doesn't like. That's true. She's such a killjoy though. This is supposed to be a comic about magic. It would be cruel to see Salem abuse his magic against the pets, so I don't want to see that. Everyone ignores Salem, and a mob goes wild over Perfection. I like that Jem looks panicked at first and tells them to try to control themselves. Salem's smart enough to say he can't compete and he's a loser, and Perfection suddenly jumps out of Jem's arms looking evil and jumps onto the table. Oh good, it's explained. She wants to eat the tropical fish. Well, it's good that the kid didn't lose her fish. It was out of character for Salem to do this instead of letting the cat get disqualified as she deserved, and guaranteeing that someone else would win for a change. If Sabrina was lecturing him about not using magic, she meant to let things take their natural course. And Salem loves to eat fish. Also, it clearly reveals magic here by making the cat fly around and fall down. People get even more excited and call the cat cool. Sabrina's glad that he saved the fish without hurting the cat, and is somehow happy that Jem's cat was made to look good. Huh? Later, she tells Salem that she said she's proud of him and he's a great pet, and is bored asking how many more of his tricks she has to watch. As we see one last body horror where he turns himself into a pretzel that still has his coloration. I really hated the name of Jem's cat. We start out the next story with Hilda talking about a brochure for the summer camp Hilda and Zelda went to when they were Sabrina's age. It sounds like the kind of luxury that wouldn't be around in the times of vedualism. Sabrina's told that the camp's head counselor was a kind, beautiful, great athlete, and the camp has hiking, arts and crafts, canoeing, rock climbing, and swimming, and Sabrina can't wait to go. So I'm guessing the so-called twist will be that she'll get disappointed because the camp isn't like that anymore. While you'd think their brochure wouldn't lie, false advertising isn't always punished for some reason. We already saw her go to camp. Then she's woken up at midnight to go to camp, and she questions, what kind of a bus comes in the middle of the night? It doesn't matter that it's a camp broom and not a bus, her point still stands. So why was this written if the writer knew it was stupid just because witches? As we can see, witches hate being woken up at midnight too, and you'd think her aunt would be just as tired and cranky as a result. The camp would have stopped this dumb practice from complaints. It's not like witches are normally nocturnal. Also, the concept of Sabrina going to a witch camp for the first time at midnight reminds me of Sabrina having to go to witch summer school at night in the 70s comic. So it'll suck for her, right? The person on the broomstick entertains herself in the boring ride by singing a repetitive song. And predictably, the camp's run down. Just because the camp's been around for a long time doesn't mean this is the only logical outcome. Why would it be allowed to get to this point? Witches could use magic to prevent that from happening, no problem. Also predictably, the head counselor is this ugly woman. It would have been a twist if it wasn't her. Of course she looks different after 300 years. So Sabrina's aunts were physical age 300 years ago. It's odd that the camp is still in business if apparently Sabrina is the only camper there. You'd think a witch would be able to make the camp fantastic with magic. How is she still chipper with the camp doing this poorly? I guess she likes the solitude. She casts a spell to turn a clay into a pot for Sabrina to take home to her aunts. I expected Sabrina to complain that it's not fulfilling if she just casts a spell to make a pot in 1 second, and the class has no educational value if that's all it teaches, because Sabrina should have known how to do this herself. Instead, somehow the old lady messes up the spell and creates an explosion of soot against her, when nothing that she said in the spell would have this be the logical outcome, and she acts like this was an accident. This is forced. Maybe the idea is that she's senile, but she would have ended up fired then. Then she tries to teach Sabrina how to shoot an arrow without a bow and sets a spell telling it to find the bullseye with the greatest of ease. And somehow the arrow follows her, when it's not like she has a picture of a bullseye on her shorts. Even if the breeze did shift, that wouldn't matter. She would have imagined the arrow as hitting the bullseye. Also, an archery course teaching an easy spell and nothing else would be worthless. Sabrina should already know how to use magic to make an arrow hit a bullseye because it'd be easy to imagine. It's not fulfilling like learning how to shoot an arrow, which you wanted to know how to do earlier. Then the old lady says that a clever witch doesn't need to paddle a canoe. I guess something will go wrong. Repeating this kind of joke isn't funny. There's usually a surprise for the punchline. The exact same thing happening is always a surprise, but we always know that she's gonna screw up, and it always defies logic. She says a spell to send them floating across the lake. Somehow they fall into the lake instead, and she finally admits that she's lost control of her powers. But how's that possible? Unless it's explained as a curse being put on her, that's stupid. It makes more sense that Sabrina won't try to get back her control of her powers, because how is she supposed to know how to do that? The counselor says that she should close down, but running a camp is all she knows how to do. Sabrina finally tells her the obvious, that she doesn't need magic for running a camp, and she bets that her aunts can figure out a way for her to stay in business. Why did anyone need to tell her this? Wouldn't she have gotten to this point on her own? She thanks the aunts for magically restoring her camp, and we see a bunch of kids there with witch hats, with a few riding horses. Hilda says that it was Sabrina's idea to make it a camp where kids can pretend to be witches. She didn't have to do that idea. I was just thinking of it being a mortal camp. But at least this way, the counselor has an excuse to keep wearing her traditional hat. She conjures up a vase as a gift for them, and somehow it blows up in a soot bomb too. I wish it was explained that someone cursed her, but then I'd wonder why she didn't find witches to remove the curse. It could be explained as a really powerful curse. It'd be a shame, but that's less insulting than no explanation at all. The first story, by Mike Gallagher, is about some lawyer trying to get Salem out of the sentence as a cat with the excuse that he's been babysitting Sabrina for 12 years, and there's a drama over the fact that Salem's insisting on leaving the house after he turns human, and doesn't even imply that he'll visit Sabrina, which could have easily not happened. Why wouldn't he think of doing that after turning human instead of outright throwing the case he somehow won to give her what she wants for once? Sabrina was being selfish, and it didn't make any sense that she would want him to stick around because most of his interaction with her, when it's not him being too selfish, is using magic in a failed attempt to improve her life that just wrecks things. I'd want to stay away from him. It was cathartic that the judge was very skeptical of Salem, but then she randomly softened up for no reason. The judge shouldn't have been written to prove Salem's case for no reason, just for him to sabotage it anyways. The second story, by Angelo, is about Salem being taken to pet show again and expected to act normal. And then when Jem's cat almost eats someone's beloved pet fish, Salem uncharacteristically saves the fish, and makes Jem's cat look really good when the story was clearly trying to make us want Jem to lose the pet show. So Jem shouldn't have been in the story. And Sabrina praises Salem for not acting like a normal cat, which makes more sense than the alternative, because of course she'd think it was worth it that someone's beloved pet wasn't eaten from his own inaction. But he still broke his word that he wouldn't use magic. So it wasn't really a message about not using magic in a pet show after all. And instead, what's more reasonable, Salem shouldn't use magic to cheat at a pet show. The final story is a bunch of forced comedy where, very predictably, Hilda's old summer camp sucks, even though witches would use magic to fix it up no problem. Because somehow her old camp counselor lost control of her powers with no explanation, leading to a bunch of gags where she somehow screws up every time and doesn't give up after the first time, and the only surprise is how she screws up. I can make sense of this by assuming she bumped into a spiteful witch and was cursed at the supermarket. At least it had a happy ending. Sabrina got her aunt to magically fix the camp, though she should have been able to do that herself. And she made a suggestion to make it a mortal camp with the unique hook that the camp uniforms were witches' hats. I kept waiting for Sabrina to complain about the fact that she was being taught to just use easy spells instead of actually being taught archery and stuff. She could say that she already knows those spells. You'd think every witch would have felt that way from sheer boredom with it. The camp would have sucked no matter what. At least it was refreshing that the ugly old witch was a good nice person and just accidentally screws up. At least it was a twist how Sabrina's camp activities sucked, and that Sabrina was the only camper there, even if it being run down and the counselor getting old was insanely predictable. And I vastly preferred Sabrina being the only camper there to the camp having the lazy, obligatory bully character and best friend character she instantly hits it off with. Compared to that, the story felt realistic and creative.